and I'm hosting this session on do-it-yourself privacy, burden or empowerment, question mark, which is the outcome of a project called Forum Privatheit, Forum Privacy, Self-Determined Life in a Digital World. And we've been working on self-protection means and strategies and policies during 2014. As you know, citizens, well, you don't have to come to CPDP to know that citizens' privacy is increasingly challenged by not only intelligence services, but also by technology developments, by law enforcement agencies, by new business models, etc., etc. And that it has been suggested not only by activists, but also by policymakers and computer scientists that there should be a means, that there should be tools to be given into citizens' hand to protect their own privacy by themselves. Over the last 20 years or so, John Borking gave kind of a timeline on Wednesday on that. Numerous tools for privacy-enhancing technologies, for privacy-preserving tools have been developed. But as you all know, and as well, frequent asking to the audience has shown, they are little used in practice. Not only by people who are aware of the problem like us, but especially among normal citizens. So it's too easy to blame the citizens that they do not make greater use of these self-protection tools. And in this panel, we would like to discuss the value of the approach to do-it-yourself privacy and ask what role self-protection can play in a networked and globalized way in a world where intelligence services seemingly have limitless power and where massive amounts of data is collected and used by companies. So we are asking, who should be responsible to make sure that citizens are protected? What are negative effects of self-protection and positive effects? And what relations do these effects have? Well, is it a feasible approach anyway, given the future trends that we foresee? And to address these questions, we have 4 distinguished speakers who will give presentations. The first one is Tobias Matzner, who has a background in philosophy and in computer science, and is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Tübingen. He is also a member of the Forum Privatheit and one of the main or principal authors of a white paper that we have published last year. We do have copies of the white paper, unfortunately only in German, somewhere in the back of the room, but also in La Village upstairs, and you can grab one if you read German during lunch. Paul Johannes is working in a project called Pro-Privacy, which is associated to the Forum Privatheit, and he will give us an impression on technical and legal aspects of privacy-enhancing technologies in his role as a lawyer and legal researcher at the University of Kassel. Then we have Seda Gürses, who has already done a great panel on crypto wars on Wednesday. She's a computer scientist and currently working as a postdoc researcher at the New York University. Before she was at the University of Leuven, and she's done a lot of work on all kinds of security and privacy issues from a technological point of view. And finally, we have Kostas Rossoglou, who is a senior legal officer at BEUC, the consumer protection organization, the voice of the consumer in Europe, as they claim themselves. And we have asked him to construct a bridge to ask if privacy protection is a part of consumer protection, or where there are analogies or differences between the two things. And I think that will cover the issues around self-protection quite nicely. And finally, we have Sarah Monteleone from the University of Groningen, who will moderate the discussion afterwards. She's been working in the security and technology and e-privacy research group, and so she's and she has a background as a lawyer as well. So, please, Tobias.
Okay, thank you all, and good voyage back home. We are asking here, is DIY data protection an empowerment or a burden? DIY data protection is the term we coined for all attempts by individual citizens to protect their privacy by using those technologies that are out there, like encryption, anonymization, PGP, Tor, browser plugins, everything that we as citizens can or must do on our own. And since we're here at CPDP, I was thinking that telling you how good those things are is like preaching to the choir. So when we ask empowerment or burden, I'll rather focus on the question why maybe that could be a burden. Important note there is that when we talk about data protection in this case, we have to think that data protection needs do not only arise against intelligent agencies. They arise against relative friends, colleagues, employers, employees, companies, and so on. This is important to note because we're all very conscious that there are some data protection and privacy protection needs where only individual tools can help in an end-to-end way if you cannot trust the state and if you cannot trust the intermediaries. But we think that we must not let us, so to say, dominate the whole discussion by that big threat. So that said, I'll go over to asking why maybe privacy protection done by the citizens can be a burden and why this is an important question in the first place. That reflection is motivated by the privacy paradox. You all know that many surveys have proven during the last years, and especially after the Edward Snowden's revelations, that many people do care for their privacy and data protection, but those tools that are out there right now are rarely used. So since that diagnosis of the privacy paradox, increasing the usage of those DIY privacy protection tools has become a policy aim in various areas. First of all, in the development of technology, where we say we need better tools, we need more usable tools, we need more transparent tools that show users in the first place what's happening to their data, which then can lead to more reflected judgments and decisions to use those data. But they've also led to education campaigns. There's many NGOs out there that, among, I've written to buzzwords on the slides, data literacy or media literacy, to increase knowledge about that, and then through this knowledge enable a better and more conscious use of those data protection tools. And I want to question the preconditions or presumptions of this approach on two levels, one pragmatic and one normative. So I'll be asking, DIY private data protection or privacy protection, can we actually do it? That's pragmatic. And should we have to do it? That's the normative part, and I'll spend a little more time on the second one. The first question, can we do it? Now, we all know that we've been, if you heard the panel right before, it already came up that judging the consequences of using information communication technologies in our world right now, the buzzword big data is all over the place, is increasingly difficult, even for interested citizens and even for experts. That is also an issue because even if I as an individual am very conscious and very attentive to where I put my data and who I let access my data, well, other people can just publish my data, and they do constantly. Data are a relational thing. Data are increasingly not focused on an individual in the sense that I can decide, well, that's about me and that's about him. For example, there are many apps on our smartphones that can access all the phone books. If you have my number, I'm just in the smart. I'm already in the social graph of whoever uses that data, whatever I do. So it's not an individual problem. It is hard to judge. And in this context, conscious and well done DIY data protection needs a lot of competence, needs a lot of resources. I just want to highlight one point, because I think you all know that, which came up yesterday in a panel on privacy companies, that in this context we run the risk of data protection becoming a luxury for those that can spare those resources. Resources here both in time and competence I can spare or I can use to protect my data, but also in terms of money, because there are more and more solutions coming out that do data protection for me, like your own cloud or something like that, which then cost money and maybe are a solution for some and not for others. And this is especially important because, and I'll come back to that, we're not starting from a plain level playing field here. We're starting from individual distributions of knowledge, of resources, and data protection needs. And since we're already having power relation and egalitarian problems here, this might be increased. That's the main point I want to make on the complexity and difficulty to judge issue. And a second point I want to note, I want to highlight is that a successful data protection done by citizens does not only depend on the availability of good, transparent, usable technology. If people protect their data, that has to do with their values, their political stance, their effective influences, emotional decisions, and so on. And this is especially important when you look at the campaigning and the attempts to increase knowledge about data protection, because most of the activists, the NGOs and so on, that advocate do-it-yourself data protection come from a rather coherent background with a rather liberal attitude, with a high valuation of technology up to technological determinist views. And those tend to speak to people which have similar political and social views. And thus, there's a problem how to address people that do not share those values. And it plays out more on the individual level as well, because data protection and privacy is in constant struggle with other values, with having good contact with their friends, having like the coolness of using the technology and so on. So there's also an issue how to make data protection cool and not just to provide good and usable tools. That said, I want to move on to the normative part, should we have to do it. And this problem arises especially when data protection by the citizens is the only or the main possibility for data protection, which is especially advocated by politics and companies, that is, by those social agents that could also maybe be responsible for data protection. So, to put it rather strongly, we want to ask, is data protection by citizens empowerment, or is it rather outsourcing of duties of the state or companies to the citizens? Or to put it the same problem in a slightly different angle, we could ask, is too much responsibility transferred from society towards the individual? That second angle is important because I think we need not only look at the state or the citizen or big companies like Google, Facebook, etc., or the citizen, but we also have to look at how there is like space in between those solutions, and maybe the things you'll be talking about, like on consumer protection, could be one of the different approaches we might have to look at for solving those problems. So I just want to highlight two areas that make clear why having to cater for your own data protection, having to be responsible for your own data protection might be a burden. The first thing is that our social life is completely permeated, at least here in the West, in Europe and the United States, by information communication technologies. Mobile communication, internet access is almost considered as a standard. Some see internet access almost like a basic service, like electricity and water. And thus, with increasing needs for data protection, time, effort, and resources are a normative problem if it comes to a technology that is so much a part of society. And I want to highlight again that this is not starting from a level playing field. If you have been to the feminist perspective and data protection panel yesterday, for example, there were brilliant studies that showed that, for example, women or young girls on the internet have way more problems and needs to manage their data and their appearance than male persons have, or male identifying persons have. So again, here's a problem that we're not distributing the same need of data protection and the same availability of data protection to everybody, but everybody uses that. That's a starting point, but everybody uses that and faces completely different needs, and we're running into problems of distribution and equality here. And the last point I want to make is on political participation, which is important for me because political participation is usually associated with speaking out, with publishing, with going public, and that thus not related to data protection or privacy claims in the first place. But opinion making and most of the activities that lead to something that goes out, that lead to political activity, is based on private talks, discussions, internet groups, web researches, internal meetings, NGOs, internal activities, citizens' initiatives, and also of finding resources that maybe, and then coming back to empowerment, that allow you in the first place to create the self-consciousness and the responsibility to then go out. So political participation, although it is eventually leading towards the public, is based on very much activity that needs very high levels of data protection. And if the only way of data protection is to do that on our own, and we have unequal access to that in the first place, here the problem of data protection arises in the context structures by fundamental democratic values, where it could be a burden because political participation should be available to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Tobias, for your interesting presentation. I really appreciate when you said, especially that having the needed resources and technical tools is not only that maybe is not enough, but also that you say that it can become a luxury. And this made me to think about especially the risk that we have nowadays, that privacy can become a kind of a elitist right. And this is particularly dangerous, like you mentioned, especially when it is linked to the exercise of fundamental rights, and in particular when this is linked to the possibility, for instance, for citizens to have public participation. So if privacy becomes elitist, and in particular when the possibility to use technology or the disclosure of data is not easy for the citizen, and it become necessary in order to participate, for instance, to a public debate, this is going to be dangerous for our democratic society. Okay, thank you. We can move now to the next speaker, Paul.
Yeah.
The floor is yours.
Thank you for your introduction. Thank you, Michael. Thank you all for coming. I think it's hard to draw a definite circle around our topic. To define privacy, it's like a task in itself, and therefore it's not easy to describe DIY privacy measures concisely. But I want to start by giving some context. Just 3 days ago, the President of the United States addressed the US Congress in a State of the Union speech, and he spoke in this speech also about the cybersecurity. And he said, no foreign nation, no hacker should be able to shut down our networks, steal our trade secrets, or invade the privacy of American families. We need to meet the evolving threats of cyber attacks, combat identity theft, and protect our children's information. It's like you can almost taste the irony. It's like palpable. There it is. Or maybe it's this room. I don't know. Maybe because there are no windows. but there's something there. Threats like cyber attacks and identity thefts are of course real. It doesn't matter who perpetrates them, who's the perpetrator. They might infringe on the victim's rights to privacy. However, you might define it in the end. There's something there. If we look at the state of surveillance now, not the state in itself, but who does surveillance on us when we use the internet? There's a vast array of perpetrators, a vast array of participators who will use your data for various reasons, will store your data, profiling by ISPs, big data analysis on their parts. There's a potential to collect all of communication data, including content and traffic metadata. And then real threat, limitless retention periods of this data, overarching reads, and no reasonable suspicion. And all this is happening warrantless and without oversight by courts, or at least by transparent courts. Well, this is a real problem, and the protection of one's privacy on the internet, may it be the content of your communications or even the whereabouts of yourselves, or the identity of yourself, is real consumer interest, which up until now he most of the time only could facilitate by himself using DIY privacy protection tools. And before I talk about these tools, just for a brief bit so that we all are on the same page, I just want to say that privacy protection and cybersecurity are often used interchangeable, but they're not. They're interconnected. They are different. Maybe they're different parts of the same coin. Privacy is part of cybersecurity, and cybersecurity is part of privacy. Maybe that's, you could put it that way. If you want to do it yourself, protect your privacy yourself, you need the right tools. As every homeware store clerk would tell you, you need the right tools. There are many tools for many various tasks. How to protect your privacy, scraping browser fingerprints, disabling cookies, and so on. But there are also ways to protect the content of your communications. That is basically encryption, and there are ways to obfuscate your traffic or location data. So you have a certain kind of anonymity or pseudonymity. With encryption, that's on the left side, you preferably want to have end-to-end this encryption and a public key infrastructure for easy use. You need strong encryption, and for obfuscation of traffic and location data, you can use various approaches like Tor network, a decentralized approach, or proxies, a centralized service, or using mixed cascades and other various technical means and ways. But for both ways, to protect your content and to secure anonymity, there are issues. There are security issues, there are usability issues, there are performance issues sometimes, and there's trust. Do I trust my facilitator? Do I trust the one who gave me the keys to my inscription, or do I trust the the company that provides me with anonymity on the internet? So, to address these issues, from a legal standpoint, from a very basic legal standpoint, we have to come back to the fact that privacy is a fundamental human right to freedom, as as written into the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. The Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union enshrines certain political, social, and economic rights of EU citizens and residents into EU law. It was drafted by the European Convention and put into force with the Treaty of Lisbon in 2009. And under the Charter of the European Union must act and legislate consistently with the Charter, and the EU courts will strike down legislation adopted by the EU's institution that contravenes the Charter. The Charter applies to the Charter applies to the institutions of the European Union and its member states. And there's the European Convention of Human Rights, which applies to the signatories of the convention, which for the most, at least from the perspective of Europe, there's the same players, but with a different court. Both these rights made the right respect for private and family life, Article 7 of the Charter, or Article 8, right to respect for private and family life, include an obligation for the state not only to protect from infringements, but to become active and to do something to ensure privacy, because it has a legal obligation to ensure that the basic freedom rights to freedom of the Charter or the Convention are or can be enjoyed by everybody. Not only to protect against infringements after the fact, but to create an environment where the freedoms can thrive. Before I go on, just one thing: since privacy is a freedom as enshrined by these by the Charter and the Convention, it ensures self-determination. Only you, we had this in the panel before, only the individual can in the end really decide what part of his personal life he wants to keep private and whatnot. He will be in the end the sole judge for the most time. This cannot hold true for all the circumstances. There has to be a balancing of interests between the individual and the right of other individuals, or the rights of the state, or the task of the state to so that the state, for example, can comply with his tasks. And this challenge is exemplified by this. It's a constant struggle between law enforcement and freedom, as we have seen in recent weeks when it comes to the topic of do-it-yourself privacy and encryption and anonymity services on the internet. Just in the last few weeks after the sad events in Paris, there has been a rise of speeches from policymakers to suppress or policies to suppress encryption, to create backdoors, and the regulation of encryptions. We have to think that we know that these are not the tasks, the opinions of the state as a whole. The government as a whole is always a part of the government that, especially the law enforcement part of the government, that wants to get regulations on encryptions, and wants to pertain the rights to decrypt any messages that are encrypted. For example, just example, in Germany, a few days ago, the Minister of the Interior said he wants to regulate encryption so as to be able to fight terror. At the same time, part of his administrations, the Federal Bureau of the Federal Agency of Security for Information Technology, actively encourages citizens to use PGP and other encryption methods. So there's most of the time the right hand doesn't know what the left is doing, or there are different opinions within the same administration. Guiding case for all these challenges to encryptions legislation or legislation towards anonymity services will be the ECJ case on the data retention directive. As you probably all know, the data retention directive has been scrapped by the ECJ because the limits imposed by the principle of proportionality in lights of Article 7 and 8 were not held up. This implies that within this case therefore is a test as to the regulation of encryption, also a proportionality test that can be applied in the future to the regulation of encryption and anonymity services. Today they exist regulations for encryption, not in general, but for certain topics. There's the regulation on the export of dual-use items. The use of encryption is allowed, but the export of strong encryption may not be allowed without a permit. And there's the directive on e-signatures and the regulation on EID, electronic identification and trust services for electronic transactions, which regulates certain technologies and trust services like e-signatures and timestamps and electronic delivery and electronic retention archival, and has tasked various departments of the EU, technical, I know, to regulate encryption and give guidelines as to what is strong encryption. So in conclusion, just 1 minute, DIY privacy protection is often feasible for the individual itself, since privacy is self-determination. Privacy protection is therefore everyone's responsibility, and do-it-yourself privacy enables self-limitation, but it is the task of the state, the government, to supply tools for self protection, for do-it-yourself privacy protection, and he has to make a legal framework that these technologies can thrive and operate. The right to encryption and the right to anonymity can be derived from the Charter of the European Union, therefore fundamental European rights. And that's it, because my time is out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. You mentioned all the legal and technical issues that are at stake, and also the fact that saying that DIY is everyone's responsibility, but also the fact that the supply of these tools should be obligatory. So I can see kind of a clear message for policy making in that. So we pass now to the next speaker, Seda.
Hello, everyone. And I'm sorry for being the bad messenger, Paul. But so, okay. So I want to make 3 main points. One, I think Paul kind of did by showing that it's maybe more of privacy as a fundamental right rather than data protection, which we might have to rely on for encryption tools. I'll come back to that. The second, I'll talk a little bit about the problems with the concepts of self-defense using encryption tools, and notice that privacy is not just about encryption-based, at least technically speaking, just about encryption-based technologies, but maybe we can come back to that in the discussion about what else should be there or is available. And second, the third point I want to make is that governments and companies are being increasingly aligned in countering encryption for self-determination of citizens, and they're also aligned in basically ridding the citizens of their fundamental rights, so kind of stripping the citizens of their rights. And so there's a 2-class citizenship that we're working with here, and that has an effect on these tools. So I'll start with the data protection privacy difference. So data protection, there's a paper that we worked this out with Claudia Diaz-Omartini. Data protection assumes that the data collecting and processing organization is trustworthy, And a lot of the encryption tools that Tobias was talking about, like PGP or Tor, assumes that the organization that might be collecting your data is actually your adversary. So there's a fundamental difference in the modeling of the relationship with the organization and some of the encryption tools. So what we find here, in a sense, is that end-to-end encryption and some of the other tools that have been mentioned, like Tor, are not necessarily called for if we would do a technical interpretation of data protection. And they don't necessarily guarantee the use of end-to-end encryption for end users. So I think in that sense, the privacy laws that you refer to are very valuable, and the e-signature to make sure that encryption remains available to end users. I'm not sure if they're sufficient, and I think that's an interesting discussion point. Coming to the problems with the concept of self-defense using privacy tools, specifically encryption-based ones, we just completed a project called Spion, which was about this word called responsibilization that comes from David Garland. It comes from policing studies where citizens get, for example, marshaled for policing activities in their neighborhoods, right? So all of a sudden the government is taking less and less care of, let's say, crime issues and instead responsibilizing the citizens. And David Wills is here, so I'm not going to be able to do a good justice to your work, and maybe you can say a few words in the discussion later, who talked about responsibilization in the sense that in the process of organizations becoming leaner and cutting costs, or in what we see in social networks right now, in the process of gaining profits, they incur certain risks, which they then simply externalize onto the citizens or the end users. And I think we see this in the case of privacy. With the collection of large databases, there are certain risks incurred with respect to either leakages or profiling, and in this case, maybe a threat to citizenship rights. And these risks are simply being externalized to the end users. And so we're basically not only externalizing these risks, but then we're also telling them to protect themselves. So we're putting citizens and end users in a kind of David versus Goliath situation, which I think is very close to what you have found in the Forum Privatheit project. We've also been studying some of the campaign sites that suggest using encryption and Tor and others. We noticed that almost all the sites propose different tools. So while we kind of seem to suggest that there's kind of a clear set of tools that people can use, there are very different kind of politics behind each of the campaign sites. Some of them are more business friendly, some of them are for so-called dissidents in oppressed countries, which is also politically very problematic. Some of them are absolutely funded by, let's say, Department of State in the US, or some dodgy funders, and military. So there's a sort of politics around these tools. Why do some of them get recommended? And then we're expecting citizens or people elsewhere around the globe, because obviously we're assuming that these tools are also globally available, to make certain decisions. And I think we're actually putting them in a very difficult situation without giving good guidance. And often in the tech community, we talk about these encryption tools, the problem being usability. While I do think there are problems with usability, and I do appreciate the hard work that the tech community puts into this work, into making these tools, I think what we're up against is a convenience thinking that has been sold to customers. For example, many of you are probably used to pressing that button called "I forgot my password" and having it sent to you in clear text through your email, which, for those who are laughing, that means you probably know that this is a serious security violation. I've actually now found that people don't store their passwords anymore, but they use this password forgetting function as a kind of way of remembering, like as a way of logging in. And if you talk with somebody coming from an encryption background, for them, if you lose your key, you lose your data, and that's clear to you, right? So we're not only against, it's not just about usability, but it's a different culture, right? And consumers today are being taught this culture that availability is the most important thing, and it's more important than their privacy and security, and availability means that they're connecting to these companies and giving their information, right? And so if we want people to use privacy tools, we also have to go against this culture, which is not about usability. The last bit I want to talk about is the alignment of governments and companies in countering encryption and also deriving or stripping citizens of their basic rights. I think a lot of this is very clear in the talks that were mentioned earlier of Obama and Cameron last week. I think we're in very sad days. I feel like we're living, in a sense, 9/11 all over again. And what we're also seeing, what we're not looking at so much, I mean, Snowden revelations kind of put our attention on intelligence agencies, and the terrorist attacks kind of help governments to elevate matters of privacy and security into national security issues, which means that they start working in a state of exception and they can break from democratic rule, and we've kind of been taught to accept this. But we also need to look at the new cybersecurity regulations, which are moving away from providing security. They basically start with saying we cannot provide security. Instead, we should do risk management. I call this, we just need to manage things when shit hits the fan, which basically means that you're moving away from securing the services to surveilling the services or monitoring your services all the time to determine when attackers have attacked, what damage they have done, and then to keep those people out of the systems in the future. And what happens here, there's also a whole information sharing clause that comes with this. I don't want to go into details, is that the governments are basically enlisting companies in a national security project through the cybersecurity title. And I don't see privacy being considered here, even though it's mentioned here and there. And this goes hand in hand with basically the two-class citizenship idea that I wanted to throw at you, which is that especially in Western countries, I mean, in other countries, citizenship rights are kind of more shaky. But here we kind of suggest that there are these basic rights, but what we're seeing is that some people can be simply stripped of all of these rights. Certain communities are already under massive amounts of surveillance. So when you've been stripped of these rights, for example, when you've been targeted as a suspicious community or a terrorist community, you cannot use encryption anymore. If you use encryption, then you're basically increasing your chances of suspicion and at this point being infiltrated, being put under massive amounts of surveillance, and now we're finding out that you can be executed. So I think what these communities are doing, when I speak with friends who are working also in Belgium about the methods these communities are using, is they're recording their conversations in case that law enforcement or intelligence agencies come after them, so that they can say, no, this is what happened during that conversation, and not the other way around. And I do see Anna Roth in the background, and maybe she can say something about being under surveillance and being asked to use encryption, and how that, how she elegantly refused, gracefully, and also turned to making her life transparent 24 hours a day, so she could have a public that protects her from this moment of being basically stripped of all your rights. Yeah, I think that's about it for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Seda, for your rich presentation, and I really like when you especially underlined the point of the responsibilization and this culture of availability of tools. And I was thinking this is especially interesting if we think about young people or even kids. If you think about responsibilize too much young people, even if you offer them the tools, I mean, it's like, how can they be able to protect themselves? And the other issues you touched. Now we move on to the next speaker, Costas.
Hello everyone. So I come from BEUC, which is a European Consumer Organization. So in order to save time, you can read the information about the organization. I'm not going to bother you with that. My objective today is simply to talk about this empowerment of consumers versus the burden. Because the empowerment of consumers is not something new that we hear in the privacy data protection debate. I think it's a holy grail of, sorry. Sorry, I missed a slide, sorry. I have it here in my notes. So you can check our members in the meantime while I'm going through this slide. The consumer empowerment idea is the holy grail of public policy, at least in Europe. Everybody's talking about it. Everybody's talking about providing consumers with the necessary tools, make consumers more responsible. And when we talked about tools, it's about choice, information. In the area of privacy, of course, we're talking about technical tools as well. We're also talking about market transparency. And then we presume that the consumer will take responsibility for every choice. And we assume that being a consumer will be a 24-hour job, so we can make decisions for ourselves. Empowerment is also about delegation of control, and the issue of control, the notion of control is key when it comes to the privacy debate. And that's right. So the notion of control is key when it comes to privacy, and it's not only about the absence of a third party holding information about us, but it's mainly also about the individual controlling himself or herself how this information is going to be used. When we look at when we do the reality check, is that the consumer is disempowered, especially in the online environment. There is too much information overload. It's impossible for an average consumer to navigate all this information and understand what's going on. The online ecosystem is increasingly complex. I think we're all struggling to understand in specific cases who is a data controller, who is a data processor, who is responsible, who is a third party, which law applies. So imagine an average consumer without the basic privacy information, education, to be responsible for making such choices. Of course, we have the problem of lack of enforcement in the online environment. We have regulators without teeth, especially when it comes to privacy data protection, and also regulators who do not have the means, technical, human resources, to enforce the law. And it's also questions of how to enforce the law against a service provider who might be anywhere in the world. And the notion of redress is also key when it comes to consumer empowerment. As an individual, can I have my rights properly enforced? Do I have individual redress? Do I have collective redress? It's mission impossible to have my rights protected. And then at the same time, we talk about self-regulation, promotion of codes of conduct, that there's too much burden on the companies. The privacy paradigm, I think Tobias already mentioned that. We see that despite the lack of awareness, the limited awareness, consumers are still concerned about privacy, and there are a lot of numbers. I think we are all aware of that. But still, consumers behave in a way that compromises their privacy. And why is that? There are different theories. I have my own views about which one of those four theories is the most realistic one. Of course, there's always the optimism that the risks that I might run into are less important than the risk of someone else in a similar situation. There's a privacy confusion over the practices of businesses. The immediate gratification effect, I think that consumers are more interested in getting a benefit in the short term than thinking the long term about the negative impact of choices they make. And then the environment, as we said, is over complex. And the cost of getting information or trying to protect myself is much higher than simply make a choice and taking the risk of that there might be no impact actually from this choice. Do it yourself is going to change the status quo. The status quo is that service providers, third parties are the ones who control the data. Individuals are in the darkness. As I always say, individuals are sleepwalking in a world without privacy, in a world of surveillance. With big data, the problem will become even bigger. So is it a game changer? Is it possible to give control back to consumers and help them make choices? Not sure. Of course, there are benefits. The system will be more transparent. If there is data ownership, this notion of ownership, data will go back to the individual. There will be more control, of course. There might be more competition, interoperability in the market, especially if we are in a commercial context. What costs? I think there is a risk of more privacy and security breaches, and always the issue of over-reliance on consumers. We should not overestimate the consumer and his capacity to navigate in this complex environment. And the main conclusion is that do it yourself. Yes, it can provide solution. We heard about some of the tools, but it cannot be the only solution. We need a strong legislative framework that provides for strong rights for the individuals, that provides for strong enforcement, for strong oversight, for robust obligations on the businesses and on states. And moving the burden on individuals is really not proportionate, especially in this environment. We cannot expect, we cannot accept that companies move the burden and the obligation on the consumer to make choice for themselves. It's a very risky scenario. And then I always mention that in the online environment, especially when it comes to privacy, the issue of redress is key. Without redress, whatever rights an individual might have are of no use. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Kostas. Before opening the floor, I will have just one question actually here for Costa. When you were talking about the different theories and why you think that people cannot use or do not use the available tools. One of the possibilities is because we know that they behave sometimes in contradiction with their statements, or observing their behaviors make us think that there are other factors that intervene. So I was just wondering, since you also underlined the importance of data protection for consumer protection, was wondering if you think that new mechanisms like that are based on these cognitive and behavioral science, nowadays more and more we talk about that, and in particular I'm talking about nudging system. Do you think it can help? Do you think this could in some way support or be complementary to this strong legislation that you mentioned?
I think it can be helpful. It can be helpful to make us understand why consumers behave in a certain way, but it's always complementary to legislation or any other regulatory measure.
I have a question for you too. Okay, so one of the biggest problems that we have right now, if you talk about DIY privacy protection based on encryption, is that I would not put my keys on my phone because they're such insecure devices, and there's been a lot of discussion about who's responsible to make sure that the devices, which is produced by a company, and then the telcos put something, and maybe Google or Apple put some software in it. Well, they also produced it. Anyways, but it's a complex environment, as you know. But what we have as an end result is our insecure devices. So the idea, and you know, for some people, this is the only device that they will use to go online, especially if you're from a more poor sort of background. This will be really your only access to the internet. Is there a way to use consumer rights to make sure that these devices are secure so that we can actually have secure and private communications over them? And do you think, even if we did have such a consumer right framework, how it would hold against governments pushing for, let's say, backdoors on these devices?
That's a very nice question. I don't think I have the answer, especially when it comes to how consumer protection can help in that area. But we always talk about a holistic approach when it comes, for example, to consumer rights in different areas. Either it's privacy by design, security by design, it's the same like safety by design in the product design, about the whole circle development of a product. It's in that case the phone. And this is not actually reflected in the way devices are being made, and also whether the consumer is also informed about when he decides, for example, to use an application to manage his passwords, for example. I'm not sure he understands what are the risks, and he just makes a choice, and then we assume that he knew. I forgot the second part.
Okay, we can open now the floor for question. I would like to, I would like please to, okay, I can come there with the microphone. I was just saying please use the microphone in the middle of the room, but.
I'm Stuart Dresner from Privacy Laws and Business, and my question is to Kostas. I know a few years ago BEUC did a wonderful survey of use of collective action by consumers on consumer redress across many European countries. And I'm wondering whether you were thinking of doing that again to see whether consumer redress is used in civil litigation for privacy cases, because I think you've got the power, the connections, the resources to conduct this research. We've tried doing some with an intern, but I think you've got more power to reach further than we have. So I suggest it would be a very useful tool for the whole community if you did such research.
Thanks for mentioning this research by BEUC. There are two problems there. The first one is that when it comes to civil litigation, and for example, the use of consumer law in the area of privacy data protection, consumer organizations do not necessarily have the right, the standing, to act for infringement of privacy or data protection legislation. To give you an example, in Germany, the German Consumer Federation, they cannot act on infringements of data protection. They always go on the basis of contract law. And they can always tackle privacy problems through the unfair contract terms legislation. So it's not an easy way to litigate. for data protection. And then the other problem is that it's very there's a very big variety of collective redress mechanisms across Europe. The first of all, collective redress is not available in every country. I think it's only 16 or 17 out of the 28 countries. And the system in every country is completely different. And the main problem is that in most countries, consumer organizations can only act on a basis of an opt-in, which means that they have to get permission by every single victim of a potential illegal behavior. When try to imagine in the online environment, when you have the behavior by a company affecting millions of consumers, how can you prove that you are a victim? Do you keep the proof of that? And are you aware of this action? Can you delegate your rights to a consumer organization? In an ideal world, there would be an opt-out system where a consumer organization or any other civil society organization can bring a collective action on behalf of all potential victims. And there are safeguards that need to be put in place, but it's not so easy. So it's also all this to say that even if we do a survey, I'm not sure that the results will be really useful, because I'm not sure that, at least in the consumer world, consumer organizations are using such mechanisms, or they don't have such mechanisms, especially in the area of privacy.
We have another question here. Sorry.
Could any of you just give one very, very good tool that you would promote? The best tool you have, and not Tor, please.
For which purpose is that? Like, there's different things. You want to be anonymous, you want to protect your data on your phone, you want to protect your data on your hard drive, you want to protect your communication live or asynchronous, you want to protect your email. There's some... Then Tor is the only answer so far. I'm sorry. Of which I know.
Please, we go. Gemma.
I think we all agree that putting the responsibility for privacy on the user is wrong, unfair, and in many other fields it'd be unacceptable. But I don't think we're going to change that in the near future. And I think, and Seda mentioned this, we have a problem because we're telling the user so many things. There's so many people telling the user so many things, and many of them are just lies. I think that the case of Anonybox is an example. But the problem with cases like Anonybox, someone puts something on a Kickstarter platform, and then it's privacy advocates and hackers say this is actually a scam. But then on the day after, you have another very similar device that doesn't get all the hype, and then people do buy into that, believing that that's a way of protecting their communications. So we're not speaking to the user in one voice. And so we have a problem, because if we're not going to win this battle overnight, but we do have some tools that are quite good, like Tor, like Tails, like loads of small solutions to big problems in the safety and the privacy of our communications. So are there any initiatives to be able to begin to have a trusted voice that users can go to until we win this battle? Like a place where people can find reliable information on what works for what, because we don't have that.
Sir.
Well, I think there are many voices, but as you said, too many voices. I know, but then it's a matter of who do you trust the most, and how do you know about these voices? I don't think a centralized approach in itself will generate trust, because then it's centralized, and once that centralized figure is breached or makes a mistake, you lose the trust again. I know what you want, but I don't think that. I really think that's asking for the Holy Grail.
I shortly mentioned that in my talk, that many of the NGOs, agencies, and so on that advocate privacy do that within a context of a larger socio-political worldview. Let's frame it that way. And I think the way in which those agencies can, or NGOs or whoever it is, can speak to you depends on how much this worldview and the worldview of the people they speak to overlap. And so we're using privacy for incredible amount of different aims right now. We want to protect us against the state. We want to protect us against big corporations. We want to, in a sense, protect our lives from being completely commodified or maybe we don't. Maybe we want to sell some parts of our lives. I don't know. So privacy is not that single monolith. It is really a right or a norm we use against various aims, which then are contextualized in various greater socio-political worldviews. And I think we need various voices that can address the various people that are out there. The problem I'm seeing right now is that most voices really speak to a rather tech-aware and rather, as I said before, liberal, libertarian kind of community, and have difficult to address other parts of society. But I don't know anybody who I would recommend or encourage to become that voice. I'm sorry.
So if I can maybe take a short moment as well. A lot of the tools that we're talking about come from communities, and they're from communities, and they, in a sense, were signaling themselves to communities that trust them, right? So there was this kind of thing. And what we're trying to do right now is to universalize these tools and scale them like Facebook. Scaling like Facebook means you adapt to the principles of consumerism and Facebook that you are possibly countering. So there's an inherent tension there of taking the community tools and making them global ones. At the same time, like when I work with activists outside of the US and Europe, they don't trust necessarily tools coming from the US for somewhat good reasons. And they don't know the people. So if you don't know the Tor people, if you don't know some of these people, it turns out you don't trust them very much, right? And when we did user studies, and this was in the US, people said they would trust Facebook more than a third party that they don't know, because they've seen Facebook for a longer time. It's a brand, they can rely on it, and maybe they can have redress, possibly. So I think there's a lot of complexity in what we want. And then, as I said, not every privacy tool is for every context. So I think the diversity is a good thing. Now, where we might want more concerted action is in standards making. So I know that people in IETF and W3C, et cetera, are trying to think about ways of what they call baking encryption into the internet. That's how it's called. It's kind of nice to think of geeks cooking, but like, what I think that's really the good approach. And Dimitri Kleiner just recently wrote a very nice article comparing the DIY tools to interventions of Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. Like in case of emergency, you can kind of take these tools and do something with them, but it doesn't solve the universal health problem. So I think if we want to have that kind of universal approach, then the standards bodies are interesting. Now, what we don't have there is a public conversation. What does it mean to bake encryption into the internet? Does it, for example, continue to increase the dependency of third world countries on first world countries to be able to put internet encryption into their countries? So there are lots of questions to be asked there. How hard should the encryption be, against which adversary, and what are the different issues in different places? This is a very difficult conversation. Like, how do you have a public conversation about a global infrastructure? If anybody has ideas, please tell me.
Thank you. We have now. Can we please collect the two questions now? So they're waiting there already since 5 minutes, I think. Please.
Yes, thank you. Kasia Szymierewicz, Pan-African Foundation. I'm looking at Seda because, Seda, you mentioned the three keywords that are very interesting for me: the scaling up, the availability paradigm that we suffer from, so to say, and the big challenges we see with security. So the backdoors and basically the fact that many secure tools, or the tools we would like to think of as secure, turn out not to be so secure. So how we move forward towards scaling up and inviting people to use more and more the good services so they can become competitive and functional, if we have the challenge of availability being the main paradigm and this security backdoor thing. Do you have any argument that you give to people who come to you and say, why? I mean, why should I really bother so much and go at such a great length as a user and take the risk that still the tool will not be secure if I have what I have now? I'm struggling with this myself because we try to sell this ideology and to people that we work with. So if you can help me, that would be great.
Hey, I also have a question rather for the tech nerds, so Seda and Tobias. So well, you were mentioning anonymization and also encryption, but maybe we should also think about different approaches, technical approaches to secure digital communication. I was thinking about steganography, right? There are really interesting approaches to that, so hiding information within other messages, images, and so on. The good thing about it is that you can't actually detect that from outside. Nobody knows that you're hiding it. So that would be really an interesting approach, and especially in countries where they take a look at who encrypts and surveil these people even more. Thanks.
I don't know if Claudia is in the room, but she very nicely says always, it takes a village to secure a service. And I think that security is about collective practice. And I think one of the mistakes with all the campaign sites we were looking at is by virtue of trying to be consumer friendly with encryption tools, they're trying to make them look like you press a button, you download, and now you're secure. And security doesn't function like that. So it's not maybe in a sense just against the availability paradigm, but it's also like bringing the security paradigm to communities. So that means that if you tell somebody they're going to use encryption, it means they need to find at least another person to use it with them. and I think people forget these things, right? Like people think it's like an app and you can just be there and everybody else will be there too, and it just isn't that. And how do you convince people? That's a difficult one. I think I've seen a lot of people just going analog, which obviously you can't do if you're not in the same location. And I think this kind of collective practice, collective responsibility is the way to go. And then you just basically don't put certain things online anymore. If you're really under threat, you just don't do it. And I don't have a better answer, unfortunately. Sorry.
Maybe I can catch up on that, because I think a very important point to make is why should I be bothering is that it's not about you individually. Seda pointed out quite beautifully how certain people that use cryptography and all those tools are under threat just for using them. So by just spreading the use, even I have nothing to hide, I'm helping protecting those people to be less salient as users that might have something to hide. That's one point. In the tech communities, there's the slogan that says anonymity wants company, which really points to that issue. You can't be anonymous when you're the only one that's using anonymity technology. And the second thing is, even from a less even if there are no people that are under complete danger or under complete threat, your data might be putting the privacy of other people in danger. That's another point that people have to recognize. So even as why should I be bothered for my data? Well, when your data becomes public, when your data enters into those databases, it can tell a lot of other people. So even if you're not bothering, you might be bothering for the people you know. That's another argument I would add to that. And coming quickly to the steganography point, I think that is one of the technologies that is overlooked a little bit, but I'm not really sure how far it can add something to the general problem we've been discussing here.
Okay, thank you. Time has been flying, and we had quite a number of really interesting and inspiring talks and good questions and a good discussion. Though we have to admit we had more questions in the end than answers. But anyway, there will be more CPDPs to discuss that in future years. And let's thank the presenters, and well, thank you to the audience.